One of the most frequently asked questions that I get, both in my personal life and as somebody who just cooks on the internet, is what types of pots and pans somebody should get for their specific use case. The spoiler is that there's not one right answer for everybody, but today I'm going to take my best stab at breaking it down so that you can make a more informed decision for yourself or maybe for somebody that you're buying a gift for. I'm also going to include some tips and tricks on both how to cook in the various types of pots and pans we're going to go over today, as well as how to clean them, because I know that's a sticking point for a lot of people. So if that's interesting to you, stick around, buckle up. It's going to be a lot of information, but I'm going to do my best to make it simple and hopefully not too boring. So before we move any further, we need to take a step back and really understand all of the different types of cookware that are available on the market today and that you may even be already considering. If you're anything like me, you probably get a ton of ads from different brands and different types of cookware, and it can get really overwhelming. So you're definitely not alone in being confused and maybe not knowing where to start. There are 4 major categories of different cookware materials that we're going to go over today, and a couple of those have some subcategories underneath as well. There's also a couple of categories of cookware that we're not really going to touch on today, but I'll mention them just so you have the big picture. As you can see, I have a ton of cookware in my own kitchen, so I've done a fair amount of testing on different brands and materials over the years. Hopefully you can learn from the mistakes that I've made and get off on a better foot. If you like this type of content, by the way, I'd be super grateful if you liked and subscribed. It'll help me make more of this kind of video in the future, and I'm hoping to cover more intimidating kitchen topics as well as product reviews and all kinds of stuff in the future. I nerd out about this stuff a lot because I studied material science in college, and I actually worked on the materials design team at Apple for a couple of years. So I love materials, which is probably not something you hear people say very often, but I'm going to try to keep things really simple today so that you don't need a material science degree to understand all of the options that are available to you and what makes the most sense. So the first category of pots and pans is nonstick, and nonstick has a couple of subcategories beneath it. We have your regular, normal, traditional nonstick pan that you probably all have cooked with at some point in your life. We have hybrid nonstick pans, which also includes a brand that you've probably seen all over social media called Hexclad. And finally, our favorite Instagram ads are for ceramic nonstick cookware, which still falls under the umbrella of nonstick despite its name. Pretty. The second major category of material is cast iron, which are these lovely black pans that you've probably seen in the kitchen of your favorite steak bro, or maybe at a campsite. Underneath the umbrella of cast iron, we have our classic black raw cast iron, but we also have these beautiful enameled cast iron pots and pans, like the ones that you may have seen from Le Creuset or Staub. Staub. The third category is carbon steel, which also has that black color, and they look a lot like cast iron, but they're a little bit thinner. These are found in a lot of your favorite These are found in a lot of your favorite professional kitchens. If you own a wok, you also may not know that you already own a carbon steel pan, because most woks, though not all, are made from carbon steel. And finally, the fourth category is stainless steel. We know it, we love it. It is all throughout everyone's kitchens, from refrigerators to mixing bowls to different types of utensils. Stainless steel is a crowd favorite for a lot of applications, and that's with good reason. And finally, just to make sure that I'm covering all my bases, we are not going to talk much about this, but there are stoneware and ceramic types of pots and pans available. Often these are for more specific use cases, like donabe pots like this one are often used for cooking rice or stews. There's also tagines and all kinds of different cookware from around the world. And the last category that we're not going to touch on and that I don't own is glass. Glass cookware has had sort of a surge in popularity, I think, with the rise of social media, because you can kind of like see your water boiling in the pot in real time. And while that's very cool, glass cookware tends to be pretty unreliable. It's really easy to break, and it's not very versatile. So we're not going to go into that, and that's why I don't own a single piece of glass cookware in my own kitchen. I also want to pause before we start deep diving into the different types of materials today to talk about a topic that is a little bit intimidating, but will be relevant to a couple of different types of materials, and that is seasoning. You've probably heard about seasoning a cast iron skillet in the past. It has this sort of mystique around it. It can be really intimidating, and there's a ton of misinformation out there, even today in 2024, about cast iron. Seasoning is not all that scary and it's not all that complicated, and despite its name has nothing to do with salt and pepper and different spices, seasoning refers to a polymerized layer of fat on the surface of a pan. And what seasoning does is basically two things. First, it ensures that a pan that would normally be prone to rusting doesn't rust. It's creating a sort of enclosed surface around that pan, so there's no places for the rust to start forming. The second is that seasoning creates a pseudo non-stick layer on the pan. It's not truly non-stick, but it does a pretty good job of ensuring that like little bits and pieces don't fully latch onto the material, again, because there's an actual physical barrier between the food and the iron. So first up, we have nonstick, and nonstick is a little bit misleading to include in the lineup of the different pots and pans we're gonna go over today. And that's because nonstick isn't a material itself. Nonstick actually refers to a coating that goes on the surface of a pot or pan. And that means that the base material of the pot or pan can be all kinds of things. It can be steel, it can be aluminum. Probably the most well-known type of nonstick coating is Teflon, which is just a brand name for a specific polymer coating, but there are other nonstick coatings out there too. Nonstick has a couple of major pros. The first is that nonstick, as its name implies, has a very slick nonstick surface. And what that means is it basically makes cleanup very, very easy. You don't need to scrub your pan, nothing is going to cling on. You probably won't even need to soak your pan. The other major pro is that nonstick is pretty accessible when it comes to price point. Because nonstick refers to the coating and not the material of the pan itself, nonstick cookware comes in a huge, huge array of different prices, more so than probably any of the other materials that we're going to talk about today. That means you can find a nonstick pan from anywhere from $5 all the way up to $200. But nonstick has a lot of cons as well, and they're all basically tied to the fact that there's a coating on the surface of a pan. A quick little lesson for you is that coatings in general are known to be very unreliable. If you've used a smartphone in the past 10 years, it probably had an oleophobic coating on the surface, and it's kind of commonly known in the industry that that coating is going to wear out in 2 to 3 months no matter what you do. The way you can think of coatings is like painting a piece of furniture. Yes, there are things you can do to make the paint stick more to the surface of the piece of furniture, but in the end, that paint is really just sitting on the surface and it's not really penetrating any deeper. So if you really wanted to, you can kind of like flake the paint off or strip it off or whatever. So the first con related to that has to do with health. We as a society discovered plastics in the 50s and 60s, and so they're a relatively new invention. And nonstick coatings arrived with the advent of modern day plastics. What we didn't know at the time, and unfortunately we needed decades of extended use to really understand, is that plastics do have a negative impact on our health. Nonstick coatings are no different. I am not a doctor and I'm not an organic chemist, so I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but I will say that it's pretty commonly accepted that if the surface of your pan is flaking or chipping or peeling, that's probably not going to be great for your health. There are ways to cut back on the possibility of the surface flaking and chipping and peeling, and that's basically with good care of your pan. For instance, you definitely don't want to cook with these at high heat, and you definitely don't want to put them in your dishwasher, which also runs at high heat. And you definitely don't want to use any abrasive materials on the surface of the pan. So that includes things like steel wool when you're cleaning, but also metal utensils when you're cooking. So I think the science is still sort of being written about what the long-term health impacts of nonstick coatings are, but a lot of people are moving away from them or have an interest in moving away from them for that reason. The second con related to nonstick is the durability of the pan. Because of the coating, this pan has a finite lifespan. It has a point at which I won't be able to use it anymore, no matter how careful I am about cooking with this thing or cleaning it. Certain pans last a little bit longer, but I would say at most you can expect to get a couple of years out of a nonstick pan, and some of them much less. And finally, because you can't heat your pan to high temperatures, that really cuts back on a lot of the versatility of the pan and the different use cases for it. So the third big con of nonstick pans is that they're not super versatile. You're not going to be able to sear a steak in a nonstick pan, or I highly recommend against it. Even in a pan like a Hexclad, which advertises that you can crank up the heat on it, at the end of the day, the nonstick coating on a Hexclad is still in that same family of polymers. And last time I checked, adding a little grid of stainless steel doesn't change the chemical properties of that coating. So I definitely wouldn't recommend it, even though they advertise it that way. The same is true for ceramic nonstick pans. There's a lot of marketing language that goes into selling these, but it turns out a lot of that marketing language is probably not true or is a bit misleading. Even the name ceramic is a bit muddy. I did my own research and ended up more confused than when I started. I'm going to link a great article from Wirecutter about sort of the marketing language and why you probably shouldn't buy one of these pans in the description. But suffice to say that the coatings on these pans are probably not all that different from the coatings on the nonstick pans that you're probably super familiar with. Despite having a lot of disadvantages, I do think nonstick cookware has a place in the kitchen. Like me, a lot of cooks keep one good nonstick pan around just to cook eggs if you're feeling kind of lazy, even though you can cook eggs in all of the different materials that I'm going to show you today. It's a little bit less of a headache to cook scrambled eggs in particular in a pan like this. I also think nonstick is great for beginners or people who are intimidated by cooking. I am a person who thinks that learning to cook is a super valuable skill and something that everyone should learn to do. And if the barrier to entry is that you need a nonstick pan that isn't as intimidating to you, I think that's very, very valid and very worth it. And even if you do already know how to cook, there's sort of this other category of person that only wants to cook if it's going to be pleasant. And that's also very valid. For example, Caraway did send me these pans to test, and in the end, it wasn't something that I wanted for myself, but I gifted these to my mom. And my mom knows how to cook. She's a pretty good cook, but she kind of hates cooking. And having a non-stick pan like this is one of the only ways that feels comfortable for her. She's the kind of person who will get super frustrated if she has to soak a pan overnight. And that's kind of the thing she cares most about. And that's why I gave her these pans, and that's why she loves them. Non-stick is not great, however, for anybody who wants to kind of move forward in learning how to cook. They want to learn how to sear steaks and sear fish, or somebody who wants something that's gonna last generations. That just won't happen with non-stick cookware. My personal pick for non-stick cookware has to be this Henkel's Capri line of non-stick pans. I got this from Costco, and as you can see, it has this white speckling inside. These white speckles are aluminum oxide ceramic particles, and they're supposed to act very similarly to the hexagon stainless steel grid in Hexclad pans. And I haven't tested Hexclad, so I can't really speak to the performance between the two, but I know that I love this pan, and I know that it has lasted me about 2 to 3 times longer than sort of your run-of-the-mill nonstick, similar to my Calphalon here. The coating on this is just starting to give out after 3 or so years, so I need to replace it, but I absolutely love this pan, and it is amazing to cook eggs on. If you're a sucker for the beautiful colors that you can get from these ceramic cookware brands, I would say again that I don't think this is a great value, but they are beautiful. And so if that's what you're optimizing for, then I would go for Caraway. Like I said, they did send me this for free, but I have kind of messed around with the Always pan from Our Place, and that thing does not have the build quality of this pan. So for my money, I would rather spend it on Caraway, and I would skip out on Our Place. Because nonstick isn't really a material, I can't say for certain whether your nonstick pans will work with an induction stove, so you'll need to make sure that you read the specifications for any specific set that you're considering to see if it is compatible. Cooking with nonstick is super simple. All you have to do is put the pan on the stove and then heat it to medium or lower heat. You definitely don't want to go higher than that because you could damage the coating of the pan, which is obviously not desirable. Once the pan is warm, you can add your oil of choice. I like to use cooking spray when I'm working with nonstick. And then once the oil's in the pan, you can add your food. Then once your food is cooked, you just want to make sure that you're using a silicone or plastic spatula. You definitely don't want to use metal because, again, it can damage the coating. If you notice that your food isn't sliding around the pan like it is here, that could be a sign that it's time to replace your nonstick pan because it could mean that the coating is damaged. To clean your nonstick, all you have to do is use a normal dish detergent like Dawn, and you just want to make sure that you use a soft sponge and not anything abrasive. So you want to stay away from things like Barkeeper's Friend or steel wool. I like to air dry my nonstick pans, but you can obviously use a dish towel or rag to dry it too. Let's talk about cast iron. So cast iron, as its name implies, is made by pouring liquid iron into a mold or casting it. That's why you end up with such a thick, heavy pan that sometimes has this rough textured surface because the molds are often made out of sand. I think in the past, manufacturers used to kind of polish this down and make it into a smooth surface, and there are higher end cast iron brands that do that today. But personally, I don't find that the textured surface makes a huge difference. Cast iron has a lot of pros. So the first is that it is almost indestructible. This is the pan of choice if you are somebody who goes camping a lot and likes to cook literally in a fire, not on top of a fire, but like somebody who throws the pan in the fire. This is the pan of choice because it's so heavy duty and so durable. In the same vein, it's kind of endlessly renewable as well. And what I mean by that is that if this pan does ever start to rust on you or looks a little funky, as long as there's not literally a hole going all the way through it, you can kind of endlessly strip and re-season your cast iron pan. So that means that this is going to have a ton of longevity. When we talk about heirloom pieces of cookware, cast iron is definitely something that will last you for generations if you treat it even half decently. Another pro is that cast iron is great for high temperature cooking. That could be anything from baking it in an oven to broiling to throwing it in a fire like I mentioned, and also getting that perfect crispy sear on a steak. I also am a big fan of the really broad range of prices that you can find cast iron at. I'm a big fan of Lodge, which is one of the bigger cast iron makers out there today. And you can get a pan like this starting at something like $25 or $30, which I think is very reasonable for something that's gonna last you a really long time. Cast iron can be really attractive as well, especially when it comes to things like enameled cast iron. Brands like Staub and Le Creuset are absolutely gorgeous. They come in a huge range of different colors. And just like uncoated cast iron, enameled cast iron is going to last for generations, which is why it has such a high price tag. When it comes to the downsides of cast iron, one is pretty obvious and people talk about it a lot, which is that this thing is heavy. I don't know how much this weighs, but I would guess it's between 5 and 7 pounds. It's really, really hefty. This is going to make things really hard for people who have mobility issues, or if you just have weak wrists like me, cast iron isn't always going to be super approachable. Cast iron is also, of course, the first material that we're talking about today that requires seasoning. So you can see here that I have this kind of shiny, slick surface. That is a well-seasoned pan. Now, like I said, seasoning is not as intimidating as it sounds, but I will say that it adds one more thing to think about. It is something that can become very second nature in the kitchen, but until you reach that point, there is a learning curve of just understanding how a seasoning layer works. If you don't want to season your cast iron, enameled cast iron doesn't require a seasoning layer. However, the enameled part of the pot does change its properties. For instance, I definitely wouldn't throw this into a campfire because the enameled surface is more fragile than just raw cast iron. And unlike cast iron, with enameled cast iron, you can't just re-season the pot if you chip off a piece of the enameled surface. So cast iron is good for a couple of different types of people. Your run-of-the-mill uncoated cast iron pan like this is gonna be great for, like I said, your steak bro, or somebody who kind of wants to push one level past a non-stick pan. It's somebody who wants to take their cooking to the next level, doesn't mind the learning curve, and is ready to put a little bit of TLC into the cooking that they do. Second category of person that I would recommend cast iron for is a bread baker. A lot of people who bake sourdough bake it in an enameled cast iron Dutch oven, much like this one, but I think I actually have a better recommendation. This is an uncoated cast iron Dutch oven, and what's really cool about it is that, as you can see, there is a lid, but there's no handle. And what that means is, like magic, I can turn this lid into a frying pan. So I like to use this for everything from frying eggs to baking cornbread, or sometimes even baking pies in this. And then with a deep pot, you can make stews, you can use it as a deep fryer, and whatever else. But here's the magic. So 1 second you have a Dutch oven, and the next you have a really beautiful sourdough bread cloche. I think that's what it's called. So this creates the perfect environment for making sourdough bread and helping it rise nice and tall. But there's a few benefits to this shape, which is one, that you don't need to drop your bread into a super hot pot, which can be a little bit scary. And I know tons of people have burned their arms doing that. Moving the bread into a more shallow bottom pan like this is a lot easier. Another benefit is that even though you can heat enameled cast iron pretty high, it can sometimes discolor the enameled coating. And when you're paying that much for an heirloom pot like a Le Creuset or a Staub, I don't know about you, but I would prefer for it to stay looking nice and pristine as possible with, you know, a little bit of character. And lastly, a lot of enameled cast iron pots come with handles on top that actually aren't very heat proof. Sometimes they're made of plastic, sometimes other things. Check your specific pot, but I have seen a fair share of people bake bread in a Dutch oven with a lid handle that is actually not meant to be heated up that high. So if there's one piece of cast iron cookware that I can recommend for somebody who doesn't have any, it's definitely this combo Dutch oven cooker. I'll drop a link below. This is so versatile, and I think it's about $50 or $60 total for 2 pans. And this is basically gonna give you everything you need from cast iron, at least at the beginning. My brand recommendation for enameled cast iron is Staub, and that's for a few reasons. For one thing, I really like that they have these condensation dripper thingies in the top of the lid. So as you are braising your, you know, I don't know, pork shank or whatever, the condensation will kind of drip off of these little nubs here, and it creates an environment for more even braising. I also really like that Staub, I think across the board, or at least most of their products, have a black interior instead of white, which some enameled cast iron does have. And the last thing comes down to aesthetics. I just like the way Staub looks. I think it's very classy, and they come in a broad range of very beautiful colors, but they are pricey. So again, enameled cast iron is for somebody who wants an heirloom piece, who makes a lot of soups and stews, and maybe someone who wants something to stay out on their stove. I know a lot of people like to keep their Le Creuset or their Staub on the stove as sort of a decorative piece. That's not really my style, but I do think it looks really nice in certain kitchens. Another downside of cast iron, which you may have heard, is that it doesn't work super well with acidic food. So you don't want to fill up a cast iron pot with tomato sauce and let it stew for hours on end. If you do have a good seasoning layer, it can withstand some amount of acid, but you definitely just don't want to leave it cooking on the stove for a long time with a highly acidic food inside. But if you have enameled cast iron, acidic foods are not a concern whatsoever. And yes, cast iron will work on induction stoves as well. Cooking with cast iron is a little trickier than cooking with nonstick, but you'll notice that with cast iron, carbon steel, and stainless steel, you'll notice there's a commonality with the process that you follow to make sure that food doesn't stick. First, you'll want to heat up the pan on high heat, and you want to make sure that the pan is pretty hot. So I like to use some water to test if the pan is hot, and you want to see that water sizzle right off of the pan. But you want to make sure that you're not heating the pan so hot that it starts smoking. So between those 2 points is ideal. This does require a little bit of babysitting, so this is where that patience comes into play, but ultimately this becomes second nature if you cook with your cast iron a lot. Once the pan is hot, I like to lower the heat down to medium so that I don't burn my food, and then I add my oil of choice. I like to cook on the stove with grapeseed oil because it has a high smoke point and it's neutral, and supposedly it's a little healthier. I don't know how true that is. For cast iron, you want to make sure that you add an ample amount of oil. This is a sticking point for some people who don't like to cook with oil, and unfortunately, good cooking just requires fat. It's just true. If you're not ready to start cooking with fat, then I would recommend that you stick with nonstick. Next comes a really important step that I sometimes forget, but I think it makes a huge difference, which is once you add the oil to your hot pan, you want to let it sit for about 30 seconds to make sure that the oil heats up. I find that if I skip this step, my food is much more likely to stick. After the 30-second window, you can add your egg or whatever food you're cooking. And unlike with nonstick, you can use a metal spatula here to flip your egg. You can see here that even on my best days, sometimes the food sticks a little bit, but the nice thing about a material like cast iron is that I can go in with my metal spatula and kind of scrape at it, and I don't have any concerns about me damaging the seasoning layer or a coating that exists on a nonstick pan. Another trick for getting food to not stick as much is to let it cook. If you're the impatient type and you're constantly poking around the edges of your egg or your steak or whatever it might be, you'll find that the food sticks more as it's cooking. Once the outer layer of the protein starts to actually cook, it'll start to release from the pan a little bit more. This is more true for things like steak, chicken, and fish than it is for eggs, but it does apply for eggs as well. This is why it's a little bit challenging to cook super soft scrambled eggs in something like a cast iron, because you're working with higher heat in general. To clean your cast iron, contrary to popular belief, you can and you should use dish soap. I like to use Dawn and my normal sponge along with the scrubby side of the sponge, and that's usually enough to get off any mess that I need to. If you have something that's really stuck on, what you'll want to do is add a little bit of water and then return the pan to the stove, bring it to a boil and let it cool down a bit. And then after that, you should be able to scrape off whatever was stuck. One really important step of cleaning your cast iron is to move your wet pan over to the stove, turn it back on and let it sit for about 2 minutes on high to medium heat. And this will ensure that your pan is completely bone dry so that there's no possibility of rusting while it's stored in your cabinet. If you're newer to cast iron and you're a little worried that your seasoning layer is not super thick yet, you may want to go in with a really thin layer of oil after you've dried your pan and store it with that super thin layer of oil. Next up, we have carbon steel. So carbon steel is a favorite of a lot of professional kitchens and in a lot of ways is similar to cast iron, but in a lot of ways is also different. Unlike cast iron, which is poured into a mold, carbon steel is stamped out of a big sheet, which means that it ends up being a lot thinner than cast iron and a little bit lighter. There's a lot to love about carbon steel. So first off, it's extremely durable, similar to cast iron, and you can kind of endlessly strip and re-season it. That means you can theoretically pass down carbon steel through the generations if you really wanted to. The next pro, if you're comparing carbon steel to cast iron, is that it's a bit lighter in the hand. And so like I mentioned, for people who have mobility issues or weak wrists like me, carbon steel is going to be a little bit better. One of the best parts of carbon steel though is its extreme versatility. It's even more versatile than something like cast iron, which is a little bit hard to maneuver. And even though it's probably not quite as popular, just like with cast iron, you can definitely take carbon steel to the campsite, toss it into the fire, and you should be fine. There are of course a couple downsides of carbon steel, and you may have heard me alluding to one already, which is that it's still really heavy. I personally think that the claims that carbon steel is light and easy to hold are a bit overblown. This thing is still really heavy and I have trouble holding it from the handle with one hand as somebody with weak wrists. I have like tendonitis from an accident. So with two hands, I can definitely maneuver this pretty easily and it's still more maneuverable than my cast iron, but carbon steel is still very heavy. Secondly, just like with cast iron, it needs to be seasoned. And I would say that this is even more of a negative with carbon steel because in my experience, the smoother surface of the carbon steel makes it harder to get that base level of seasoning on. There are pre-seasoned carbon steel pans out there. Mine did not come pre-seasoned, and so I was working from a completely bare metal surface. It took, I'm ashamed to say, it took almost a year to really lay down a durable enough seasoning layer that I felt comfortable cooking stickier foods in this pan. It was kind of a labor of love, but I got there eventually. You know that this pan is seasoned because these start out kind of a normal silvery metal color. And when they turn this pitch black, that's all seasoning. It kind of makes sense that they're so popular in kitchens where they're getting so much more mileage out of the pan. And so they're building up those seasoning layers much more quickly. And it's probably more practical than if it's in your home kitchen. And the last thing is that I have personally heard after posting some videos of my carbon steel that certain brands, including the one that I own, which is called Matfer Bourgeat, I love this pan, I have no issues with it, but a lot of people do say that it ends up warping on the stove. I think that I've heard that it tends to be more so electric stoves that do this, electric coil stoves specifically. I have a gas stove, so I haven't had any issues with that, but your mileage may vary. And yes, carbon steel will work on induction stoves. Another potential downside of carbon steel is the price point. So carbon steel isn't the most expensive type of material you'll find. However, the floor for prices starts a lot higher than something like cast iron or nonstick. Usually a pan like this will run anywhere from $50 to $100, but people do also say that you can buy them at restaurant supply stores if you're okay with a no-name pan, and they're much cheaper that way. I haven't tried that, but if I do get another carbon steel pan at any point in time, I probably will go to a restaurant supply store. I would personally recommend carbon steel to someone who is more serious about cooking, who already has used cast iron for some amount of time and kind of understands how seasoning works and is not super deterred at the idea of needing to be a little bit gentle with the pan for a while, but having it pay off in the long run. It's also going to be someone who wants something really versatile in the kitchen, maybe sears a lot of steaks or cooks a lot of fish. and someone who's not quite ready to maybe move on to stainless steel yet, but that's kind of in their line of sight. Cooking with carbon steel is in a lot of ways kind of similar to cooking with cast iron, but also kind of different. So to start, you'll want to make sure that the pan is put over high heat, and you want to make sure that the pan is very hot before you put any food in. Again, you don't quite want to hit that smoking point. If you do, you can just turn back the heat and let it cool down a little bit. But ideally, you want to put the oil in just before smoking point. Once you add your oil, and again, you want to use an ample amount of oil. I like to use at least 3 to 4 tablespoons or so, especially with something sticky like eggs. You're going to want to wait that 30 seconds to make sure that the oil heats up. This is really, really important. And after that 30 seconds and after the oil is kind of shimmering and hot, you can add your food in. Just like with cast iron, you can use metal utensils, and it helps to have a metal spatula because it will allow you to scrape off any food that does happen to get stuck. In this case, you can see my eggs are slipping right off of the pan. To clean carbon steel, you can use normal dish soap, just like with your cast iron, and you can use the scrubby side of the sponge. The one exception is if your pan is pretty new and you're just starting to put down some seasoning layers, you may want to exercise a little bit of extra caution and baby the pan a little bit, because I find that the earlier stages of seasoning a carbon steel are a little trickier. And sometimes those early stages of seasoning will flake off more easily when you're washing the pan or when you're cooking with it. Because of this, you may also want to use a silicone spatula or a plastic spatula at the beginning when you're just starting to cook with carbon steel. Once you're done washing your carbon steel, you want to make sure that you return it back to the stove just like the cast iron. Turn the heat to high, set a timer for 2 minutes so you don't forget about it, and ensure that the water completely evaporates off and that the pan is bone dry before you put it away. Just like with cast iron, if your carbon steel seasoning layer is new and not super thick, you may want to go in with a really, really thin layer of oil after your pan is dry, just to make sure that there's no risk of the pan rusting. And finally, I've saved the best for last, in my opinion, which is stainless steel. Stainless steel is kind of an interesting category of material because it usually isn't just stainless steel. A lot of stainless steel pans out there have some amount of cladding. So cladding basically means that you're sandwiching different materials together. And a lot of stainless steel pans have sort of an aluminum or a copper core running throughout them because stainless steel itself isn't a particularly great conductor. The pros of stainless are that I think it's really beautiful. Mine's well worn and I can probably clean this off, but I just haven't. But I think stainless steel pans look really beautiful, and they come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Just like with cast iron and carbon steel, stainless steel can be an heirloom quality item depending on how nice of a pan you buy. But if you invest, a stainless steel set of pots and pans should last you at least a lifetime. Stainless steel is also really good at searing, especially if you buy a tri-ply clad stainless steel pan like mine. I definitely recommend buying cladded stainless steel if you intend on doing a lot of searing and stuff like that. Stainless steel is also very durable. I wouldn't necessarily take it to a campsite because it can discolor, as you can see, even though it's in great working condition. But I will say that if you have a little bottle of Barkeeper's Friend, you can restore this beautiful shine to your pots and pans super quickly. So even though people do kind of complain about food getting stuck sometimes, I think that it's pretty easy to restore your stainless steel back to a really beautiful finish. Stainless steel is also incredibly versatile. You can sear in it, you can saute in it, you can fry in it, you can do just about whatever you want in a stainless steel pan. And another huge pro is that stainless, I think, is even more versatile than any of the other pots and pans I mentioned because of its weight. So stainless is significantly lighter in the hand than both carbon steel and cast iron. So it's fantastic for people with mobility issues or weak wrists like me. Another pro of stainless steel, the list goes on and on, is that you don't need to season it. This will not rust if you leave it out without a seasoning layer. And in fact, you can't really season it. So yeah, it's lower maintenance in some ways and maybe higher maintenance in other ways that we'll get to in a second. There are only really 2 downsides to stainless steel but they're kind of big downsides for some people. So the first is that stainless steel can be expensive. It definitely depends on the brand and the type of stainless steel pan that you buy. But if you buy a tri-ply clad set, like I recommend, the cheapest you're gonna find is somewhere in the ballpark of $40 to $60 for a single pan, and you can get a better deal if you buy a set. So that price point is not super high, but it's also not super affordable for some people. So it falls somewhere in the middle. And if you buy a brand like All Clad, that number can be much, much, much higher. I think some of their individual pans cost over $200 each. The second, of course, is that I think stainless steel has traumatized a lot of people with the way that food can stick to it. So because it doesn't have a seasoning layer, there's a very specific way that you have to cook with stainless steel in order to get some amount of non-stick or less sticky properties out of it. And that learning curve is just a huge pain for some people, and some people never kind of move past it. And if that's you, then you may have ended up with a lot of really stuck food, which means a lot of soaking the pan and a lot of scrubbing. But that being said, there is a proper way to cook with stainless steel. And believe it or not, I do sometimes cook really fluffy, soft scrambled eggs in a stainless steel pot, and it's totally fine. In terms of brand recommendations, I own both All Clad pans as well as a brand called Tramontina, and I can say that my daily driver across the board is Tramontina. I've had them for at least 6 or 7 years at this point, and despite some superficial coloring like this, which again is kind of my fault and that I can probably get rid of, I would say Tramontina holds up just as well, if not better in some cases, than my All Clad. So if you're on more of a budget, I would definitely recommend checking out sets of Tramontina cookware. I'll include a link below for a set that I would recommend, but keep in mind that these will last a really long time if you treat them even half decently. And yes, you can use stainless on induction stoves. So I recommend stainless steel to anybody who is really serious about cooking, who does have some patience in the kitchen, who has kind of worked their way up and has been cooking for not necessarily a certain number of years, but does understand the complexities of different types of cooking and want something really versatile that's gonna last a really long time. Stainless steel is for a more serious cook just because it can be really frustrating and a little bit demoralizing to have food get stuck to it all the time. So I don't recommend it if you are kind of just moving off of nonstick. I would first go to cast iron or carbon steel as an in-between option, just so you can start to get used to cooking with a different material. Cooking with stainless steel is super daunting for a lot of people, and with good reason, because it can be very sticky. But there's a couple tricks to make sure that your food won't stick to your stainless steel, and I swear I cook soft scrambled eggs in a stainless steel pot using these methods, and I don't have any stickage. Just like with carbon steel and cast iron, you wanna put your pan over high heat and make sure that the pan gets nice and hot. Unlike with those other two materials, you can use the mercury ball test here. There's lots of videos online about this, but the way that it works is basically you want to get a cup of room temperature tap water, and you're gonna start flicking little bits of water at the pan as it starts to heat up. If the water hits the pan and just starts sizzling, it's not ready. And if the water turns into little beads that start to immediately evaporate and kind of freak out, it's too hot. What you wanna see instead is the droplets of water hitting the pan, balling up into what looks like kind of perfect spheres and having them dance around the pan. Once you hit this stage, you can turn the heat down to medium, and then you wanna make sure that there's no more residual droplets floating around, because those will splatter when they hit oil, so dump those out. You're gonna add your oil of choice. Again, I use grapeseed. And the most important step, just like those other materials, is to wait 30 seconds after adding your oil to make sure that it's nice and hot. Another way to check for this is to make sure that the oil looks like it's shimmery, but this takes about 30 to 60 seconds. Then you can add your food. And just like with the other materials, if the food is sticking, especially if it's a protein like a steak or a chicken or fish, you wanna make sure that you don't fuss around with it too much. Just trust the process, let it cook, and the edges of the protein often will release from the pan as it cooks. Just like with the other two materials, you can use a metal spatula here, and it can come in handy to scrape things off of the pan if need be. And to wash stainless steel, just like with the other materials, you can use regular soap, but what's nice about stainless steel is that you can also use abrasives. Barkeeper's Friend is an absolute must if you have a stainless steel set of pots and pans, and it will save your butt. Even the sort of brown discoloration that you see on some of my stainless steel pans can come off with some Barkeeper's Friend, but I'm a little lazy and it doesn't impact the way that the pans cook, so that's just a personal preference. For stainless steel, you don't need to make sure that the pan dries before you put it away. I mean, obviously you probably want to dry it, but you can just use a towel instead of putting the pan back on the stove. That part's not necessary. Okay, that was a ton of yapping. So if you stuck around this long, thank you, first of all. And secondly, I hope that I answered most of the questions that you had about what type of cookware might work best for you. I also want to mention that I think that mixing and matching cookware is great. As you can see, I do it in my own kitchen. So you may want to have a cast iron for making sourdough or bringing camping with you, while you also have a non-stick for eggs and whatever else, whatever combination of pots and pans works for you. But if you're a person who wants a beautiful, seamless set of pots and pans that all match each other, that's also definitely an option. So ultimately it comes down to your preferences, the way you cook, and the kind of things that you're optimizing for. There's definitely not one right answer for everybody. I'm also gonna throw up a chart right now comparing all of the different materials and some of the main attributes that people are looking for in different types of cookware, so you can kind of compare everything at a glance in case you need this in the future. So take a screenshot. I'll also put it on my blog, but here you go. One final tip I'd share is that if you are somebody who's newer to cooking and you're kind of one of those people, okay. One other piece of advice I have is that if you're newer to cooking and you're a person who maybe feels like you can learn a lot of stuff really quickly, and you're the kind of person who jumps to buying the nicest, fanciest version of something first, I kind of wouldn't recommend doing that for cookware, because you may end up with a horrible experience from trying to cook with stainless steel cookware that just turns you off to cooking completely. I can't say that's gonna be true for everybody, but I've seen it happen to a fair number of people. So exercise caution and exercise a little bit of humility, and don't feel bad if you want to go with nonstick. I think that's a totally reasonable option. If there are any questions I didn't get to, please feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay. Oh, almost fell out of my chair. Okay, I think that's it for now. One more reminder to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will catch you next time.